All right, so today I thought I would talk about something technical, specifically a setting that I use on my camera all the time. And it doesn't matter what I'm shooting, doesn't matter where I'm shooting, I always have my camera in manual mode. So on your camera, you have a dial on the top, and you'll notice that there are a lot of settings there. And I would say probably the most popular setting on here is auto. And that's usually the setting it's on when you take it out of the box and start using your camera for the first time without changing anything. That dial mode will be on auto. And that's okay. I mean, that means that the camera is ready to go and the camera is going to do all the work for you as far as exposure. But the opposite of auto is manual. So if you see the letter M, that means it's manual. Okay, and manual means that I have to set all the exposure settings. I have to decide what the aperture will be, the ISO, and the shutter speed. So why don't I use auto? Why do I have to use manual? There's a lot of reasons why I use manual mode. And probably the most important one is something called exposure compensation. So to explain that a little better, let's do a little experiment. Okay, so let's put our camera on auto and find something bright to photograph. If you're outside, or you're probably inside if you're watching this video, go outside and take a shot of the sky if it's daylight, or use lamplight, something that's bright. So I'm pointing towards the sun right now, so I'm going to take a shot. Okay, and then I'm going to look on the LCD panel and look at the picture. I also want to look at the settings. So on the LCD, when you're reviewing your picture, you should be able to see your settings. If you don't, then what you need to do is you need to go into your camera's menu and change the display settings so that you can see the aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So once you have that up on the screen, just make note of that. Okay, now take your camera and point it towards something darker. Okay, so for me, it would have to be the ground here. So much darker scene than up there. So now on the LCD, I'm going to take a look again. And now with your two pictures, kind of scroll back and forth and make note of the exposure settings. See how they're different from each other. Well, that should make sense to you because a darker scene is going to be exposed differently than a lighter scene. Okay, but how does the camera do that? How does it know it needs to change a setting to get that exposure? So to help you understand that, look through your viewfinder again. So put your camera up to your eye and look through the viewfinder. And you're going to see on the bottom, you're going to see something that looks like this. Notice that on the bottom, you see that scale. If you're shooting with a Canon, you might see it on the right. It might be a vertical position that it's in. But regardless, you have this, it's called exposure meter that you can see through the viewfinder. Okay, and notice that when you point towards something really bright, notice that there's a like an upside down triangle or a mark right above the 0. Okay, now point it towards something darker. Notice that that mark is still there on the 0. It hasn't changed. No matter what you point the camera at, when you're in auto mode, it's always going to look like that. That's the camera's meter telling you how it's going to expose the scene. And so it wants everything in the scene to look neutral. I mean, really what the camera is doing in auto mode is it's taking the darks and the brights and everything and kind of averaging them out. And you could be pointing at something that's completely white. Like if you live up north, maybe you have snow, you point at something that's completely white and that camera's meter is still going to expose right down the middle. And if you take a shot of that snow, what's it going to look like? It's going to look gray. Okay? Likewise, if you take a shot of something that's almost completely black, in auto mode, it's going to render it more gray than black. Okay? So the camera just wants everything to be kind of neutral. That doesn't sound good, but you know, Most scenes, a lot of scenes, especially outdoors, you have a little bit of dark, a little bit of white, and a lot of mid-tones. And that sometimes works, you know. I mean, you can get a shot, an average exposure on that, and it looks okay. But most of the time, it's not going to give you the exposure you really want. I'm going to give you some examples of why I prefer to have it in manual mode so that I can control where that mark in the meter falls. I don't want it to be on the 0 all the time. Sometimes I want it to be to the right, sometimes I want it to be to the left. Okay, so let me give you some examples. Okay, so here we have a typical scene of a white bird in the water, and notice that the scene is mostly dark. The bird maybe is about 15% of the entire scene, and you've got these dark areas in the back. You've got the mangrove tree, and then you have the dark reflections on the water. So most of the scene is dark. And if I had shot this scene in auto, okay, if I had let the camera do the exposure for me, it would have looked like this. What a difference. So notice that the dark areas are a lot brighter, and more importantly, look at the white feathers on the bird and how blown out they are. There's no detail in those feathers whatsoever. So compare that to the original photograph where the bird feathers are more detailed, which is exactly what I want. So if I had shot that in auto exposure, at the bottom of the viewfinder, it would have looked like this. So notice that the exposure is, as it always is when you shoot in auto, it's right down the middle. So it's taking those dark areas and it's saying, you know what, the dark areas are too dark, so we're going to make sure we add some light to that at the expense of the white bird. So I don't want that to happen. So to avoid that, so to get my shot looking like this, I have to underexpose. And so by underexposing, you can see that my setting is going to be to the left of the middle. So I'm going to be taking some light away from this scene to get the correct exposure on those white feathers. Okay, so for this next example, here I have a really bright scene. I have a lot of white clouds reflecting on the water. If I had exposed this scene in auto exposure, it would have looked like this. Notice how much darker everything is. So now the camera is looking at all these bright white areas and it's trying to expose them down the middle. And remember, you're going to see that meter right down the middle when you are in auto exposure. So that's not what I wanted. So if I want to get a scene like this, I'm going to have to overexpose. So you can see here that the exposure would be to the right of the middle to get that overexposure. So one more quick example, and this is a scene where I probably did expose it right down the middle. So I don't always underexpose, I don't always overexpose, but given that this scene has a lot of bright areas as well as dark areas and a lot of midtones, exposing right down the middle would work quite well. Okay, so I showed you some examples of why I use exposure compensation and how that gives me that creative leverage. And I didn't go into detail on the settings as far as if I know I need to overexpose a scene, what do I change? Aperture, shutter speed, ISO? Something has to change, right, to overexpose or underexpose. I don't want to go into those details in this video. It gets a little too complicated trying to explain that. But it's part of the decision-making process when you're out there shooting. And so the whole point here is to show you, to demonstrate to you that by having full technical control over my camera, I also have creative control. And that's really what it's all about. So if you haven't yet used manual mode, get out there and experiment. I mean, that's really the only way to learn is every shot you take is going to be a learning experience, whether it's a bad shot or a good shot. So get out there, play around with the settings, get used to reading that meter. You know, when you're looking through the viewfinder, get used to looking at that. And yeah, and just you know, just take as many shots as you can and learn from that and get that creative edge, because that's really what it's all about.
Upon my garden gates, I